Well, good morning, church. This week we are starting a brand new sermon series where for the next 7 weeks we're going to be in this series called I Am, looking at the 7 I Am statements that Jesus makes about himself that are recorded for us in the Gospel of John. And these 7 statements, so they all begin with the words I am, and then Jesus grabs a hold of some everyday thing or everyday idea that people would be familiar with in his day, and he connects some part of his identity, his purpose, his mission to that thing in order to take a physical object or an idea and use it to communicate something about who he is. And so there's 2 primary reasons or purposes why Jesus does this. Number 1, he's showing us who he is. He's showing the followers, his followers in the crowd in that day, who he is and what he came to do. But the second thing that he's doing is he's in about as direct a way as he does throughout the Gospels, making the bold claim to be not only like God or from God, but to be God himself. And that is the unique claim of Christianity, that Jesus is fully man and fully God. And now we can easily miss that through these statements. And so we need to, in order to catch this, turn back to the book of Exodus in the Old Testament. So in Exodus, God appears to Moses at the burning bush, and he calls Moses to lead his people, the nation of Israel, out of slavery, out of oppression in Egypt, into the land that he'd promised to give to them. And so in chapter 3, it says this: God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you've brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship me on this mountain. And so then Moses says to God, because he's afraid, he says, well, suppose I go to the Israelites and say, God's called me to lead you. And they say, we don't believe you. What's the name of the one who has sent you? He says, God, what should I tell them? What's your name? And then it says in verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. And so Jesus, as he's giving these I am statements in his ministry, as he's speaking to these crowds full of Jewish people who would be well-versed in the Old Testament, they would understand these stories, they would know the history, they would think back to that moment where God appeared to Moses and he said, I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you. So then as Jesus uses this exact same phrase to describe something about himself, something about his nature and identity and purpose, he is connecting in their minds his life, his ministry with God himself. It's the most direct way that he says to the people, I and the Father are one. I am who I am. It's why C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity presents this argument in terms of, as we think about who Jesus is, and we sort of need to settle on a position of what do we believe about Jesus? Was he a good man? Was he a prophet? Was he the Son of God? Is he to be ignored? Is he to be accepted? Should we trust him? Should we not? C.S. Lewis makes the argument and says there's really only 3 positions that we can hold in this issue. He says, the first is this: Jesus was a liar. Jesus is not to be trusted, that he claimed to be something that he really wasn't. And so we shouldn't trust him. We shouldn't follow him. He was a liar, leading people astray. The second position, he says, is that Jesus wasn't intending to mislead people. He wasn't trying to trick people or lie to people. He genuinely believed that he was the Son of God, but he was delusional. And so he wasn't a liar, he was a lunatic, is one way that it's often put. He says the third option, and the only other option that remains, is that Jesus actually was and is who he claimed to be. That he actually did the things that are recorded, that he actually said the things that were said about him. That Jesus truly died and rose again and ascended into heaven, that he really is fully man and fully God. Lewis says those are the only 3 options we have as we think about who Jesus is to us. He's either a liar, he's a lunatic, or he's a Lord. He says the one thing that he cannot be is a good man, a moral teacher, an example for us to follow, but not God. He says either he is Lord of all or he's Lord of nothing. And so as we explore this first I am statement, where Jesus says in verse 35, I am the bread of life. Jesus is inviting us to become aware of this reality, that the things that we seek to satisfy us, that he is the only one who can satisfy those longings. That this is the first identity statement Jesus makes about himself that we have in this book, that Jesus makes this bold claim that he is the only one who can satisfy the longings of your soul. the cravings of your heart. And so as we jump into this text and look at this story and look at this claim that Jesus makes about himself, we'll talk about the hunger we have and the food that fills us. And we'll end by talking about Jesus as the better bread. So the hunger we have, the food that fills us, and Jesus is the better bread. And so as we begin, I invite you to pray with me. And you can pray a simple prayer. Pray simply that God would speak to you, because that's what prayer is. We say that often here. Prayer is speaking to God and listening for his voice. And so I invite you to pray together with me now. So Jesus, this morning, I thank you that you are the bread of life, that for all the ways in which we have hunger and longing in our hearts, God, beyond physical hunger, the things that we deeply desire, that Jesus, you care about those longings. And you promise that you are the bread of life, that you are the one that fills those longings and satisfies the needs, the desires, the dreams that we have, not necessarily in the ways that we want to or would expect you to, but that you know what we need and you can fulfill us, you can satisfy us. And so, Jesus, I pray that we would know you today, that you would speak to us, help us to hear your voice. I pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen. So let's talk about this idea of the hunger we have. So just prior to this passage, Jesus had fed 5,000 people. Perhaps you've heard of that miracle before. It's one of the most famous miracles that Jesus performed in his ministry. So Jesus was teaching the crowds and he was performing miracles. He was healing sick people. He was helping blind people see and lame people walk. And so this crowd would begin to follow him as he would go out doing his ministry. And so at one point there were over 5,000 people that follow him out. And so he has them sit down on the hillside. And he says to his disciples, where are we going to get food to feed all these people? They've come to see us. They've come to hear me teach. They've come to be healed. Let's make sure that we feed them. And the disciples look around and they say, it would take half a year's wages to feed these people. Like, Jesus, we don't have what we need to do this. And Jesus kind of just puts it back on them. And he says, well, let's just go, and why don't you go and see what we have, see what we can find. And so one of the disciples comes back and says, Jesus, I found this kid, and he's got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, but that's not even going to be a start to feed all these people. But Jesus surprisingly takes the food, and he has the people sit down. And he prays and he thanks God for these 5 loaves of bread and these 2 small fish. And he begins to break the food and give it to his disciples. And he encourages them to distribute it to all the people who have sat down on the hillside. And everybody had enough to eat. And in fact, they had so much to eat that at the end of it, there were 12 baskets left over. And I like to think that Jesus had it so that there was just 12 baskets so that each disciple could kind of have a basket as sort of this reminder of this amazing miracle that Jesus performed, feeding all these people. And now it's really important because bread was a staple of the ancient diet in the Near East. It was eaten at every meal. 60-70% of the ancient Jews' diet was bread. And much of life in those times and in those days was spent finding food or producing food, growing food. So much of your life revolved around food security and figuring out where would your next meal come from. And so then these crowds, in the story tells us, the crowds look at this and they say, in Jesus, we've finally found someone who can give us what we need. They see this miracle that Jesus performs, and they don't marvel so much at who Jesus is. Who is this man that might do this? They simply focus on the fact that their stomachs were full, that they received the food that they need. It says in verse 14, after the people saw the sign he had performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. And so it says, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and to make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. And so for the crowds, they saw not Jesus, but they saw the gift that Jesus provided, the physical food that Jesus provided. And they said, we've got to make this guy our king. We need to harness this power. It's going to be great for us. You know, he can provide for us. He can provide for our needs. And so they seek Jesus out, and then there's this story that kind of falls in between these 2 parts, talking about bread and talking about food. There's this story where Jesus, his disciples leave in a boat, and they go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus wasn't with them. He had gone to the mountain to pray. But then Jesus joins them, and he walks on the water. And so then it says later on in the story, it says some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. And it says, once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, They got into the boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. And so they come to Jesus, and then Jesus says to them, they say, Rabbi, when did you get here? And Jesus says, very truly I tell you, you're looking for me not because you saw the signs that I performed, but because you ate the loaves and you had your fill. So Jesus here really clearly basically says to the crowd, the reason why your motivation in following after me is all wrong. It's confused. You're not following after me because you want to know more about who I am. You're following after me because I multiplied the loaves and I multiplied the fish for you, and you ate and had your fill. So instead of wanting Jesus, they simply wanted what Jesus could do for them, right? Because that was their perspective, is in this person, in this prophet, we've found an endless supply of food. We've found the person who can provide for our needs, who can answer our problems, who can cure our woes. And Jesus says this was an exercise in missing the point altogether. And I think that we can similarly miss the point of Jesus, because sometimes we want the gifts, not the giver. Sometimes we want the things Jesus can do for us and the things Jesus does do for us, rather than simply wanting Jesus himself. And we become just like the crowds. We have these hungers or longings or needs in our life, whatever they might be, for physical provision, for relational satisfaction, for a sense of belonging, identity, purpose. And we seek to find these things, but we seek them in the wrong ways and in the wrong places. What do you hunger for? Maybe it's to be known, to be truly known by someone. Maybe it's to be loved. Perhaps it's a hunger to have meaning, to feel like your life has value, your life has a purpose. Perhaps it's hunger for self-worth. You see, we have these hungers, and then we look to certain means to satisfy those hungers, right? So there's the hunger itself, and then there's the things that we hope to be the answer or the solution to those hungers. And maybe that's accolades. Maybe that's the things people think about us, the things they say about us, or it's accomplishments in our career, in our schooling, in our family life, in athletic achievements. Perhaps it's fame or fortune. Maybe it's kids or your career, or comforts or experiences. Maybe it's that slightly bigger home or that slightly newer car, whatever it might be. Sometimes we want those things rather than what Jesus actually wants to give us and what Jesus actually wants to do within us. And I think Jesus uses this story, he uses this example, not to tell them that their hunger doesn't matter, and not even to tell them that that physical hunger doesn't matter. In fact, Jesus was the one who multiplied the bread and multiplied the fish. Jesus cares about the physical hungers that we have. He cares about the real, genuine needs that we have in our life. So the longing you have, the hunger you have is not wrong. Jesus simply wants you to know that often we look in the wrong places to fill these needs, to fill these hungers. We need to find the food that truly fills. Which is why Jesus in verse 27, so in 26, Jesus says, truly I tell you, you're looking for me, not because you saw the signs, not because you were amazed that only God could do something like this. He says, but instead you're looking for me because you ate the loaves and you had your fill. In verse 27, he says, do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures. You see, Jesus is saying here, he says, hey, the bread that I gave you, yeah, that's great. But the bread that I gave you won't fill your hunger ultimately. It won't fill the greatest hunger, the deepest hunger that you have in your hearts. And later on, he talks again about it, and he said, you know what? Moses gave manna from heaven, and every day God provided this manna, this bread on the ground, and the Israelites ate their fill. And he says, and they died in the desert anyways. But Jesus says, the bread that I give you, he says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. The bread you want won't fill your hunger like the bread of life can. There's a quote that I always remember by Jim Carrey, who's rich and famous, has, by so many people's standards, everything you could ever want in life. And he says this, he says, I think that everybody should get rich and famous and do everything that they ever dreamed of so that they can see that it's not the answer. All the things that Jim Carrey looked to fill his hunger money, status, possessions, fame, all of those things, he said, I think everyone should get those things so that they can realize that even those things aren't enough to satisfy you. Olivia Rodrigo, an actress and famous musician, she's 22 years old, and by the time she's 22, she's won 3 Grammy Awards, 7 Billboard Awards. She was Times Entertainer of the Year in 2021, and yet she writes this song. This is Making the Bed. She says, I'm so tired of being the girl that I am. Every good thing has turned into something I dread, and I'm playing the victim so well in my head, but it's me who's making the bed. And later on in the song, she says, I got the things I wanted. It's just not what I imagined. And so often, church, life can feel like standing on the shore by the ocean with a cup in our hand, and there's a thirst in our life, and our attempts to quench that thirst are like scooping this cup into the ocean and drinking of the ocean water, and with every sip we take, every attempt, whether it's likes on Instagram or praise in the workplace or collecting that next paycheck or attaining that next goal, whatever it is, it's like taking a sip of ocean water, and it's just leaving you more and more thirsty, more and more hungry for the true thing that can quench your thirst, that can satisfy your hunger. And Jesus says, I am that bread. I am the satisfaction for the hunger in your soul. You see, we're searching for fulfillment. We're looking for meaning, identity, purpose, direction. But all the things that we look to be fixes just ultimately leave us feeling empty. So where are you searching for satisfaction? If you're really honest with yourself, what are the ways in which you are looking to people or accomplishments or possessions, whatever it might be? What are you looking to, thinking, if I can just get there, then my life will be okay? If I can just achieve that, then things will make sense. Then I won't always be striving for the next level. Then I'll feel good about myself. Then I'll feel like I matter. Then I'll feel like life is okay. What's that next sip that you're trying to take? Where are you searching for satisfaction and fulfillment? Because you need to find the food that truly fills. And Jesus offers better bread. Jesus offers better bread. He says, I am the bread of life. I am the bread of life. In verse 35, he says, whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. In Jesus, what bread is to your body, Jesus wants to be to your soul. What bread is to your body, Jesus wants to be to your soul. He's not saying that the physical things don't matter. He's not saying that physical nourishment doesn't matter, but he's saying there is a nourishment for your soul that you're trying to find elsewhere. And he says all those things are just empty calories. But he says, I have what you need. The longing of your heart, the greatest cravings of your soul, the only place you can find that filling is in coming to Jesus. In Jesus, the presence of God would dwell among the people of God. And that's what Jesus is saying here. He says, it's my presence more than the next meal that you need the most. And then later on in this passage in verse 51, Jesus says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven, and whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I give for the life of the world. And so here Jesus is pointing to this future reality that in some mysterious way, he's talking about his death, his sacrificial death. In some mysterious way, the sinless life, the sacrificial death, and the miraculous resurrection of Jesus open up the way for us to experience this satisfaction for our soul, this filling for the hunger that we have in our hearts, for meaning, for belonging, for salvation, that someone would save us and make us okay. And it's interesting, too, that as Jesus talks about his life as the bread, and he says in verse 51, he says, I'm the living bread, and this bread, whoever eats this bread will live forever, and the bread is my flesh. He says it's my body. Jesus is saying here that true life is found in receiving Jesus' sacrificial death in our place. And I think beyond that, Jesus is saying that true life is found in laying our life down sacrificially for others. And so the people hear all this and they ask him, they say, what must we do to do the works that God requires? And Jesus answered, the work of God is simply this, to believe in the one that he has sent. He says it's simply to believe. And now this belief is an act of trust that Jesus has what you need. It's an act of trust, an act of confidence that Jesus is true, that Jesus is trustworthy, that his presence in your life is the thing that you need the most. That if the hunger that you have, if the longing you have is for belonging, Jesus says, anyone who comes to me, I receive. I turn no one away. That if your hunger is for identity, a sense of identity, he says you can be adopted into God's family. You can be adopted into God's family, a son or a daughter of the creator of the universe. And it's not about what you do to be accepted. It's about what I have done so that you are already accepted. You can already be adopted. If your hunger is for worth, Jesus says to you, you are so worthy that I will die on a cross for you. You are so worthy. Your life is so valuable to me that I'll give up my life so that you can have yours. If it's a hunger for purpose, Jesus says, I'm on a mission to make all things good and beautiful. I'm on a mission to rescue the whole world. And I want to start with your heart. I want to start with you. And then I want to fill you with my very spirit. And I want to use you. I want to call you into my mission in the world of making everything good and beautiful and lovely again. I want to reconcile all things to myself. I want to create the kind of kingdom where there's no pain, there's no loneliness, there's no hurt, there's no need, there's no injustice. And I'm calling you into that mission of making all things new again. Jesus is the better bread. And so we can bring our hunger to Jesus and invite him to fill what's unfulfilled in our lives. Because Jesus is the only one who can satisfy the cravings of our soul. And it's interesting to me, just all of the foreshadowing that's in this passage in John chapter 6. This is before the cross. This is before the Passover supper. But we know that if we follow through the gospel stories, Jesus would be betrayed by someone closest to him. But on the night he was betrayed, Jesus would share this meal with his disciples, with his followers, and he would take bread at that meal and he blessed it. He gave thanks for it, just like he gave thanks for the 5 loaves and the 2 fish on the hill on that one afternoon. He broke the bread and blessed it, and he gave it to his followers, and he said, take and eat. This is my body, which is for you. And that's what the Lord's Supper is. That when we come to the table, when we receive the body and blood of Jesus in the bread and the cup, we regularly reorient ourselves around this promise that Jesus is the bread of life, that the things that we're chasing to be bread to us, to be the thing that fills our hunger, that causes us to feel fulfilled, causes us to feel like we're okay, that we intentionally lay those things aside as we come to the table and we remind ourselves that Jesus is the bread of life, that it's through his sacrifice in our place that we are made one with God, that we have peace with God, that we can receive grace and mercy and forgiveness. And so as we move into a time of receiving the Lord's Supper, receiving his body, I want you to invite Jesus to speak to you about the bread that you've been trying to fill up on and the hunger in your heart that's there. Invite him to speak to you about the ways in which you've looked to other things, to other people, to fill that need, to fill the longing in your life. Invite Jesus to fill those spaces. Invite him to show you, to teach you what it means that he is the bread of life, that the nourishment, the sustenance, the fulfilling that you need, Jesus offers to you freely in his life and his death and his new life for you. And so let's pray together. Jesus, we come before you, and I pray that you would help us to take long enough now to sit and reflect and listen to you on the things that we're really longing for, that really matter to us. And God, many of them really matter to you. But Jesus, if there are ways that we think that the solution lies in someone or something else, would you help us to see that actually the thing that we think will fix the problem, the thing that we think will satisfy that craving in our soul, is no replacement for the satisfaction, the longing, the salvation that you offer to us. So Jesus, teach us what it means that you are the bread of life, that when we receive you, when we come to you, when we say, Jesus, I want to be sustained by you. I want you to satisfy those longings, those cravings, that you come and you do. And so, Jesus, help us to look to you, not simply to the good things that you might do for us or within us, but to look to you and to receive you, the bread of life.